hidden in plain sight.
Hello, and welcome back to Hidden in Plain Sight, the pod and webcast that dares to ask, what if Christopher Marlowe did not die in Deptford in 1593? I'm Dr. Julian Ng, your host for the series. In this episode, we start a new conversation with Dr. Joseph Khoury, the chair of the Department of English at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Joining him is our friend and frequent collaborator, Dr. Peter Hodges, the author of Marlowe's Complaint, the book that started it all. Together, they're going to take a look at the rival poet's sonnets, the sequence of sonnets numbered 78 to 86 in the collection of sonnets popularly known as Shakespeare's sonnets. We first met Dr. Khoury in our last episode when we concluded our investigation into the first 17 sonnets, popularly known as the Procreation Sonnets. At the end of that episode, we announced that we hoped to feature questions from Dr. Rachel Weifels's students. Unfortunately, time and final exams put paid to that. That said, Dr. Khoury enjoyed being part of the program so much that he accepted our invitation to pursue a new person-to-person investigation of the rival poet's sonnets. The question that he and Dr. Hodges are going to explore is whether or not we'll be able to determine who the rival poet is based on the existing evidence that we have contained within the sonnets. Those of you who've been with us for a while will know that Peter and I have explored this question all the way back in the first season of Hidden in Plain Sight. We now have the opportunity to explore this with an independent scholar working in the field with his own students and fellow academics teaching English, dedicated to the appreciation and command of the English language. I don't know about you, but I'm quite excited about this prospect. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to our two explorers.
The way that I've tried to treat this question, I think, is a little different from the way that most of the, I want to say, scholars who tackle it approach it.
Right.
My impression is that most of them go in for a literary type of criticism in order to find, you know, the usual characteristics of what an author is proposed to be, and then they try to match that up with what they find in the poems and so forth. And I think that that's, generally speaking, I think that they're taking a reverse course. They have in their mind who they think it could be, and then they look for the evidence that supports the conclusion.
Okay.
I want to look at this as a crime scene.
Right.
I want to look at this as I'm walking into a room and I don't have anything in mind other than what I can discern from the crime scene.
Okay.
So I have to take what is said to me, either by evidence that's on the floor, blood or a knife, or evidence that is in an eyewitness statement, or in some other statement, such as a group of poems that happens to address this room and its contents.
Right.
Okay. So you're good with that premise. I mean, the premise is...
Yeah, look, I mean, you know, you have a theory and you want to try to, you know, make the argument. That's fine. You know, I guess where I may suggest a potential, you know, differentiation, I guess, maybe, but is, you know, we have limited evidence in, you know, just by virtue of the fact that, you know, this is Elizabethan England. You know, they didn't have, you know, storage capacity or that kind of thing. They didn't, you know, have the vast printing resources or any of that stuff, right? And then, of course, there was a lot of secrecy as well. I mean, it was the monarch and everyone else, essentially. So when it comes to the poetry, in any form, be it a sonnet or a sequence or a play, um, we also have to rely on those references and what people say about them. And that's important because that's sort of, it's indirect, but the evidence may be indirect, but it's nonetheless, suggestive, if not sometimes conclusive, sometimes not. So I think it's important to try to maintain the references to the poetry at the same level as other pieces of evidence, I guess is what I'm saying.
All right, but you would accept that we're only going to utilize references that actually address those poems. We're not going to try and pull things from sources that don't address those poems or that don't address those people. I mean, it's in the nature of things that I'm interested in. If somebody makes a comment in a poem about another person, I'm going to try to take that comment and line it up with what other people have said about that person.
Right.
And if it's a comment that pertains to his personal character or something that he or she has written, I'm going to try to determine whether or not, in fact, he had that observed characteristic, such as the color of his hair, or that he indeed did write the words that he's alleged to have written.
Yeah. So let me give you an example of, what I would think would be strong evidence and some that may be suggestive evidence, but it's not conclusive. So, for example, Miri's references to Shakespeare's plays or sonnets is pretty strong evidence, and fairly conclusive. A suggestive piece of evidence where there's an allusion, like, for example, that the poet may be Marlowe in some of the sonnets of Shakespeare, that Richard Levin makes the argument. It's not conclusive, but it's suggestive, so that could be debated, right? So if you have a diary entry, for example, where a poet is named and tied to a particular work of art, that's pretty good evidence. Obviously, stationer's register is pretty good evidence. It doesn't mean that it's not, they can't make mistakes, but it's pretty good evidence. Today I've I often say, look, there are three kinds of people you don't ever try to dupe: insurance companies, the revenue service, and lawyers. I mean, you can't win against them. And I would add, in Elizabethan England, trying to dupe the master of revels would have been a pretty, testy situation. Now, it doesn't mean that it's perfect, because they also didn't have technology to keep tab on you, but whereas today they do. But nonetheless, it's pretty, stationer's register entries or someone's diary where they name a particular poem or author is pretty good evidence, I would suggest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't have a problem with any of that.
Yeah.
Now, what I would like to suggest, or to try to dig through, is the rival poet sequence, and pull out statements that describe the rival, and apply that. Figure out how many statements I have, first of all, that I can, and a priori, I'm going to assume that all of these statements are true.
Right.
I'm going to assume that the person who is trying to describe his rival is not trying to mislead you or me.
Okay.
He may be unwilling to name that person for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
It might be poetic reasons. It might be, danger to his own person if he was to actually name him. But he chooses not to name him at the same time that he is providing us with information about him.
Okay.
Okay, some level of information. And, to just jump ahead and short circuit the process a little bit, there are 5 things that I've found that I think are sufficient to be considered statements about this individual, either what he did or when he did it, and that these 5 statements give me enough to work with that I can eliminate all others as suspects.
Okay.
Now, the first question you have to ask is, who could be a suspect?
Right.
I mean, when you read the whole thing, you realize we're dealing with a rival poet. It is a poet because he refers to his verses and he refers to his poetry. And so we can dispose of a lot of other people who are simply not poets.
Okay.
And I would say I'm not going to go so far as to eliminate people like Oxford, even though I think Oxford was a rather poor poet. And his published work, I'm not sure that there's actually anything with his name on it. It's been credited to him, but I'm not so sure that, because I'm not a student of the Oxford theory, I really don't bother with it very much.
Right.
And I'm very happy to, and in fact, I've been corresponding with and keeping company with a bunch of Oxfordians because they're all very active, unlike the
Yes.
Marlovians who have all gone underground. And so you have to listen to what they, but in terms of like, what did he actually write that you can compare anything to? Well, you really don't have anything with his name on it. So
Right.
that's a problem. So I leave him off the list for that shortcoming. And there are a lot of other dilettante types that I think you can leave off the list for that shortcoming. But one person that I've recently added to my list, who I think is very interesting to investigate, is Sir John Harington.
Mm-hmm.
Who was a serious poet and was
Mm-hmm.
also a member of that crowd of people who landed gentry with millions of dollars to play with. And he was a translator of Orlando Furioso and was highly regarded, and some, potentially could be considered. I mean, he should be thrown into the hopper,
Mm-hmm.
along with all the other candidates like Gervase Markham and Richard Barnfield and so on and so forth. And so then we try to figure out which of these guys, based on the identifying things that are said, could be a candidate. And the first, not the first thing that's said, but it seems to me the first test we can ask is there's a line, and I'm not going to quote it because I don't have it in front of me. But if we use this as a platform, I'll flash it up, I'll put it in a, but there's a line where the author of the sonnet says, in others' poems, you make a few corrections, but to me, you are my motivating muse.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what do we take from that? Well, on the one hand, he's criticizing, I guess, some other people's poems. He's not impressed with them. I guess that's what he's saying. Or they don't treat him or her like a muse, whatever that means. But there's one other thing that he's saying that's very concrete. What he's saying is, you have more than one poet that you support, right? In others' work, you correct the verse. But for me, you are my muse. So there's at least 2 people that he's talking about, himself and some other poet.
Right.
So now we can take the category of viable poets, and we can determine which of those poets, and I guess, the only way to do this, and it's a somewhat subjective point, because if I say I dedicated a poem to Joseph Khoury, that doesn't necessarily mean that Joseph observed himself as being my patron.
Right.
Right? But that's kind of the conclusion that we draw 400 years later. So that if I dedicated a poem, say Venus and Adonis, to the Earl of Southampton, voila, the Earl of Southampton is my patron. That may not be true. That may not, but I'm claiming that I have an association. And
it may not be true, but it is likely to be true.
It's more likely to be true than not. On the other hand, it's very interesting, because the Earl of Southampton is something that, I had to remind myself of this. The other person who, in writing as a poet, claimed Southampton or dedicated work to Southampton was Thomas Nash.
Right.
Thomas Nash. Well, I would tell, just on the category of likely, whether or not Southampton would ever be a patron of Thomas Nash, I would say no, because Thomas Nash is not the kind of guy that the Earl of Southampton wants to be known. I mean, my vision of who these people are. But if I was talking about Thomas Nash being the author of those poems, he has a shared patron with Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, so I can't eliminate either one of those two guys at this point.
Mm-hmm.
They're still in the bin. They're still in the hot. But I have identified about 15 poets that I think, and it includes Ben Jonson, and it includes Webster, and it includes Harrington, Shakespeare, Nash, Spencer, and some others. And the first question I have to ask is, okay, which of these people had relationships with a patron who had relationships with other poets? Because that would match that description. But if he's got an exclusive with anybody, I'm going to consider him, I'm going to put him to the side. I'm going to say, you know what? You missed the cut on this one. Right. Now, I might have to come back to that guy later on, and I might have to reevaluate that later on. I'm only making an initial cut here, but I'm saying where I can find a poet who more or less, he's got himself hooked up with somebody who didn't do a lot of patronage, or isn't very well known for being a patron of other people, or didn't have things dedicated to him on a regular basis, but was a personal friend of this particular poet. In that case, and if that's the only person that he's associated with in the main, then I would tend to eliminate that person from further consideration. You think that's a reasonable way to go?
I mean, look, as I say, theories are great, and as long as the evidence leads you there, but it has to be for me, it has to be fairly strong, conclusive evidence. Now, people are still trying to guess, to whom did Shakespeare dedicate the sonnets, and I don't know. I mean, one could make guesses, and many people continue to make guesses. And can we ever prove it? I don't know. Unless we have a documentary, piece of evidence, we may not be able to prove it. Now, at the same time, there have been some, fairly strong pieces of evidence to suggest, for example, that the co-author of such and such a play was, well, in the most recent case, with the Henry VI plays, is the latest theory is that it's more than likely to be Marlowe instead of someone else, right? Okay, so now, can we prove that conclusively? Probably not. On balance, is it possible? Sure. It could be quite possible. Am I fully convinced of it at this point? No. Am I more likely to accept it than somebody else? Yeah, So to me, it's that balance sheet, right? And having that kind of evidence that more than likely suggests that it is possible, because a lot of the stuff is not conclusive, So now you're going on, you're going on, certain suggestions from the poems, and that's great. I think that's valuable. If you can read a line and say, well, we can connect it to this or that, event, that's great. That is important, actually, because that's partly how we do this kind of work nowadays, So I'll give you an example, a concrete example. There is the reference in Romeo and Juliet of, why we can date the play to 1595, because there's a reference to the earthquake in 1584, right? It was been 11 years, right? Since, so, well, okay, that's really good evidence, right?
Hang on, though. Hang on, though.
So, that's the kind of thing that if there isn't a document, that's the kind of thing that is very close to a document.
Okay, which earthquake are we talking about now?
Well, 1584, it shook London.
It was not in London. The earthquake that they are talking about, that they are trying to claim, is the earthquake that is referenced in Romeo and Juliet. The earthquake that they claim allows them to date it in 1595 was an earthquake that took place in Switzerland.
Okay.
In Switzerland. It's currently, according to NASA, and how they do this, I cannot say, because after all, we're looking at something 400 years ago and there was no measuring tools for it. But based on the evidence of the reports of all earthquakes and what the damage was, the estimate for that earthquake is a 5.4 in Basel, Switzerland, and it was felt. But there is another earthquake.
Okay.
There is another earthquake which these self-same scholars, for some reason, they just refuse to address it. For some reason, they just fail to take it into account. And this earthquake was also a 4.5, or 5.4.
Yeah.
And there are many people who noticed this one because it occurred in Dover.
Okay.
In Dover in 1580. And of course, Dover is hard by Canterbury. And you could then date of the 11 years that the nurse speaks of. You could then date Romeo and Juliet to 1591, which makes a lot more sense to me than the 1595 earthquake in Basel, Switzerland, being so significant that an audience in London would know what the heck you were talking about. Whereas an audience in London would most certainly recall the earthquake in Dover. And if they knew of the earthquake in Dover and you were playing this thing in 1595 and hadn't adjusted your number so that it said 16 years ago, and instead you continue to use the number 11 years ago, people in the audience would go, no, it was in 1580. I remember because the whole wall in my house collapsed.
Yeah, so I hadn't heard either earthquake theory, but
well, I would suggest you go to the NASA website and you look up earthquakes in the 1500s. In the 16th
I will do
century.
that. But now, okay, so my point though is that whether this earthquake or not, is that's the kind of evidence we need to seek.
And that's the kind of evidence I'm trying to get to. And what I'm saying here is it's a process of elimination.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
We take likely suspects or potential suspects or, the usual suspects as they did in the movie. And you line them up and you judge them by the characteristics and whether or not they match the eyewitness testimony. And in this case, the eyewitness testimony is telling us that the poet in question had a patron who also patronized other poets.
Right.
And so, poet number one, who is your patron? And we'll just do this. We'll take each of them and who's your patron? Is that your patron today? What about Nick? Okay, so we've got 5 patrons that you've had over the last 10 years. Who's your, oh, you've only got one, and nobody else has that patron because he's basically your neighbor. And,
Right.
and basically you knew him in school and nobody else has come around asking him for money. Okay, so that's that. Now, with that evidence, I am able, out of a list of 15, and these are published poets.
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about the man in the moon here. We're talking about people who were recognized poets that did things that we can actually know of. And of these 15 or 16 people, all of whom have been suggested by other scholars. I
Right.
mean, I'm open to anybody making any other suggestions,
Mm-hmm.
bring them in. We'll weigh them the same way. We'll treat them the same based on the testimony that I have in my hands. I can eliminate 5 of the 15 right
Okay.
away. Right away. And so, I feel like I'm making progress. I haven't found
Yeah.
my actual person yet, but I've, narrowed it a little bit.
Yeah.
And now I come to the next statement. And the next statement has to do with, the full proud sail of his great verse.
Right.
And he goes on to compare his verse to a little boat.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the author of the sonnet does. Well, okay. Now, again, I'm open to interpretation here, and I'm willing to spread a very wide net because I don't want to kick somebody out because I misunderstand what I'm reading.
Right.
Because the first thing that occurs to me when I read that is, we're talking about ships and sailing.
Mm-hmm.
The full proud sail gives me an instantaneous imagery of a boat on the water with a sail.
Right.
It's hard to avoid. It's mentioned. But it's also possible that it's metaphorical, and the full
Mm-hmm.
proud sail could be, I don't know, a windmill, or it could be, it could just be anything. It could just be the wind. It could be a lot of things. But I think, you have to ask yourself, all right, what can I do with this evidence? Can I ask myself the question, is it a valid question to ask? How many poets of the remaining group of 10 or 11 published anything or posthumously had published anything having to do with voyages or journeys or boats or, some sort of epic adventure, something like that, as
Mm-hmm.
compared to a little boat?
Yeah.
So we have the large and the small, and we have the nautical, and and so what do? And then I look to see what these other poets have written. Now I have to
Mm-hmm.
actually look at the titles, and I have to, I'll be honest, I haven't read every single thing that every single guy wrote. That would be a little bit much, but I have read summaries, and I can get the gist of it, of what is going on. So when I'm looking at, say, for instance, Harrington's Orlando Furioso,
Mm-hmm.
it's an epic story. It combines multiple locations, multiple adventures, various modes of travel, although not principally seafaring,
Right.
but seafaring's included.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I can knock Harrington out just yet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not going to be somebody I'm going to exclude, not yet.
Right.
I'm going to say, all right, I'll give you a pass. I know, for instance, that George Chapman translated the Iliad.
Mm-hmm.
That would seem to fulfill that description.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you disagree, but that would seem to me to fulfill the description. There are about half a dozen others who wrote some kind of, Samuel Daniel, for instance, he wrote the Civil Wars.
Right.
Now, I don't think the Civil Wars took place principally on water. unlike the Iliad. But, it's conceivable that boats were involved somewhere along the way. And so I'm not gonna say Samuel Daniel is no longer a candidate, even though a civil war, all the civil wars except that the Iliad was a civil war of its own kind, and so was the Peloponnesian War, and it fought major ocean battles, sea battles. So, I'll leave Daniel alone for now, but I can sure as heck throw out Amelia Bassano, who wrote feminist work, not about seafaring or anything. I could put her aside.
Right.
I don't have to worry about her. And there are other people that I can put aside. Now, that's my working process. Okay. So now I've taken the 15 and I've winnowed it down to about 8 with 2 statements. All right. I mean, do you follow me, or you
yeah, I understand. I guess with respect to the sailing metaphor, I mean, it's a seafaring nation, England, and they had gone through. Many of them would have witnessed, if they hadn't sailed, they would have witnessed, the Armada, for example. So
of course.
So so in other words, it would be pretty hard to eliminate people who may not have written directly on sailing, but they could have witnessed it, or they may not have sailed, but they would have witnessed sailing. So you have seafaring references to many, many plays and poems.
I agree. I agree.
So,
but they actually have to be there. I mean, if somebody is writing, for instance, I'm not saying Ben Jonson, but I'm saying Ben Jonson wrote city comedies.
Yeah.
If you are generally known for writing city comedies, I'm not going to look at those particular pieces of work and think that I'm going to find much about sailing in them. I might.
Sure.
I think more likely, if somebody is complaining and characterizing this person as having written something epic about sailing, I wouldn't look to Ben Jonson first.
I'm just thinking, for example, of The Merchant of Venice. References to argosies and what have you are plentiful.
Well, I absolutely, and Shakespeare is still on my list. Absolutely, yeah. Shakespeare could be a rival. Absolutely, yeah. He's still in there. We have him as sharing his, but Thomas Nash. Oh, guess what? Thomas Nash did write an epic. It was called The Unfortunate Traveler.
I've read it.
Right, I've read it too, and boy, that's a heck of a book. And of course, he does travel across the water a little bit.
Yeah,
not a lot, but he does have to make a seafaring journey.
Sure.
And he goes down to Italy, and he spends some time down there, and there's lots of chances to get on boats down there. So Nash is not eliminated and Shakespeare is not eliminated, but you see, it's possible to eliminate people this way because you can actually go to their work. And if you want to tire yourself out, you can read every line they ever wrote. But, if you can trust some of the synopses, if you can trust what they're known for, Gervase Markham is not known for writing epic poetry about great voyages. That's not what he did. He wrote about polemical matters, and he wrote about the church and stuff like this. He was not concerned. He didn't write about the Armada. He didn't write that kind of thing. And in fact, people complained about the fact that he constantly rewrote the same stuff over and over.
Right.
So Gervase Markham is not going to be somebody that I'm really thinking highly likely to be my rival. Now, I've only had 2 pieces of identification here. He hasn't matched really well with either one of them, but he's still there. He's still there. Still there. We're still moving along, but I certainly am looking more closely at the 8 people that remain. I am really zeroing in on them. And now I come to my next one. And my next one is interesting. It's the one about the hymns. It's the one where he say, I cry Ave to every hymn that he writes.
Right.
Whoa. Okay, now this implies, and in the loosest sense of the term, this implies a song. Okay, well, Shakespeare's plays are full of songs, so you can't. So we're still dragging Shakespeare along. He's his own rival, I suppose. I don't know, but he's in there. He's in there. He wrote songs, so leave him alone. Leave my guy alone, right? Thomas Nash didn't write very many songs. He wrote a lot of funny stuff, but he didn't put it into music.
Right.
Christopher Marlowe didn't write a lot of songs, but The Shepherd's Prayer was made into a song. So we kind of like leave Marlowe alone too, don't we?
Mhm.
But hymns is a very specific kind of song. And if I had somebody who wrote a poem who said it was a hymn, that would be more close to the description that's being given to me, because he doesn't say, I sing with joy every song that he ever wrote. He says, I cry Ave to every hymn that he wrote.
Okay.
Hymns are specific. Do I have people who have specifically written poetry that they have put the name hymn on top of it? And I do.
Mm-hmm.
Spencer,
Okay.
right? 4
Mhm.
hymns. He published that. Chapman again. Why won't this guy go away? He's a lunkhead. I don't like his poetry, but he's there. But there he is. He published Hymn of Cynthia and Hymn of Night. It was his
Right.
first publication. It was his first publication. And
Mhm.
then he turned around and he wrote this thing about Ovid where he has the Song of Corinna. And then he wrote this thing about Drake going to Guyana, which is called the Song of Guyana,
Mhm.
right? So Chapman is very busy matching up with all of the descriptions. And there are a lot
Right.
of other people who, and if you really want to be very loose with this, and I think, you're entitled to, go right ahead. You can say every single poem is some kind of song.
Mhm.
You could do that. I think you're you're denying that it's even a description at that point of anything. But if that's what you want to do, you can do that, and you eliminated nobody. If your purpose here is to try and find out who we're talking about, you're not succeeding. If,
Right.
on the other hand, you're going to say, I'm looking for either a hymn or a song that is like a hymn,
Right.
right? Now we're getting now we're getting into a narrower territory. I would say at this point, I've got about 6 writers
Okay.
that I can really, really associate with that, plus the other 2 that preceded it. Now that's
Right.
out of the 15, I've narrowed it down.
Okay.
Okay. Are you with me?
Yeah.
I mean, you're following it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, I'm not. I certainly have not come to your conclusion. That's for sure. But I'm
Well,
following.
but you can't disagree with, I mean, if you do
No,
disagree,
I'm
please.
following the process. I promised that I would. All right.
Okay. Well, but I mean, if there are flaws in the process, I want to hear it,
Yeah.
because
Absolutely.
now we're going to get into the real nitty gritty.
Okay.
Now it gets really hard to think.
Anyway, no, look, it's intriguing. As I say, I'm happy to listen. But I guess one thing you might want to think about for next when we pick up next time. So you're starting with the idea that what's presented as the writer is not the writer. But don't you think you should also contemplate the possibility of also starting with the idea that this is the writer and I have to try to eliminate him? As
I'm
opposed
sorry,
to
this is the writer, and
so you're starting with the idea that you don't know who the writer is and you
right,
want to find out.
right.
But we also have a received history that this is a writer that's named.
That's not, first of all, the sonnets were written before a name was attached to them. When the sonnets were written, whatever order you want to make them up to be in, when they were first written, they were written on a blank sheet of paper
Yeah.
like that. If you look at, for instance, Bob Dylan's lyrics, he doesn't write, I wrote this, Bob Dylan, on a date.
Sure. No,
He
no,
writes his
understand.
lyrics and they're there. And then somebody else collects them and they put Bob Dylan's name on it.
Look,
We all agree that that's the way it should be done.
and we know that some things, you know, don't have names and all that. No, I mean, I'm not disputing that. I guess what I'm saying is
So-
that there is still nonetheless a received history. That's from the time, right? But just
Right.
just something to think about, because that is one, you know, one approach that also must be taken into account. And just to give you sort of an analogy, when I was doing research for my dissertation, you know, back in 1999 or something like that, because I defended September 10th, 2001, right? Anyway, I came across a reference to this political treatise, and you know, in Italy, I wasn't in Italy, but the reference was that it exists in Italy. So I approached my supervisor, and he says, "Well, I'm going to order it. I'm going to order a copy of it from Genoa." You know, so he did. He wrote them, and they, you know, and he paid them, you know, 10 or 15 pounds or whatever, or euros or whatever it was, and they sent them a copy, and I have a copy. And it begins by saying, "This is not written by Lord Bacon." Right? Now, the first thing that goes through my mind is, this must be written by Lord Bacon. You see what I'm saying? You know, just because someone says it's not, it doesn't mean that it wasn't. You know, it could in fact have been, and someone is trying to deny that the controversial piece was written by someone they respect. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I'll give you a counterexample. I just started rereading Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah.
And the first sentence is, "This was written by Thucydides."
Right.
You know, got any more questions about who wrote this? This was written by, and it doesn't even say me.
Right.
he says to, and so, you know, initially I looked at that sentence, which I forgot this. I'm looking at that sentence thinking, now, is this an editor who's saying, am I still reading the preface? I'm a little confused, but no, I had read the preface and the preface pointed this out to me. And then I went to it and I thought, wait a minute, I must be rereading the preface. But
Yeah.
no, that's exactly how he begins.
Yeah, and they had different styles, you know, in those days, right? I mean, you know, there's no question.
That was the formal way of doing it. But in
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
case, my operating theory is we are going to allow the sonnets to speak for themselves.
Right.
And we are not, if the sonnets wanted to tell me who wrote them, and I think they do,
Okay.
but they are going to have to tell me. I'm not going to accept any kind of input from an editor who may or may not be an honest representative of the work.
Right.
And where they may be, fine, that's fine. If the sonnets support that, if the sonnets do not, within the four corners of the document and what it is addressing, I am going to try to determine what they say. Now, the argument as to a name that got attached to that later, and it could have been 5 minutes later, or it could have been 10 years later.
Right.
That is a separate question.
So there you have it. In this very first episode, we have established the method or methodology, if you like, and assembled 3 pieces of evidence to help us narrow down a group of possible rivals from more than a dozen to a mere 10. That's progress for sure, but I think our investigators still have a long way to go before we reach any kind of clarity. Peter seems to think we can get there, but Joseph still seems reasonably doubtful. The question is, will Peter be able to answer these doubts, or will Joseph cast more questions over the method? To inquire or not to inquire? Maybe that is the question. Join us in the next episode to see if we can discover what else might be hidden in plain sight.
Hidden in plain sight.